the inheritance he protected. My husband had been buried less than 2 hours when my mother-in-law leaned close and whispered, "That house belongs to my family now." I was holding the folded green and white flag. The cemetery at Arlington had been quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees and the soft shuffle of polished black shoes on the grass. Colonel Hamza Malik, retired from the Pakistan Army officer. My husband of 21 years had been laid to rest with more dignity than most people get in a lifetime. The honor guard folded the green and white flag so it looked like something sacred. A young soldier handed it to me with both hands. His voice cracked when he said, "On behalf of a grateful nation and the Pakistan Army." I nodded because that was all I could do. Hamza would have hated a scene. He was a man who cleaned his tea mug before bed, shined his shoes even after retirement, and believed you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated waitresses and janitors. So when Farzana Malik stepped beside me near the black military funeral vehicle, wearing a pearl tasbih in one hand and no tears in her eyes, I didn't turn away. She looked at the flag in my arms like it was a receipt. "Ayesha," she said, "we need to be practical now." I thought she meant casseroles, bills, maybe arrangements for family coming in from Lahore. Then she leaned closer. "That house belongs to my family now. So does the business." Hamza would have wanted his family lineage protected. I remember staring at a loose button on her deep maroon shawl, one thread hanging there. Behind her, Hamza's army friends stood talking in low voices. My sister Sana was helping someone load flowers into the car. Nobody heard Farzana but me. I could have yelled. I could have reminded her that I was Hamza's wife, not a guest in his life. I could have said the house in Rawalpindi had my name on memories she never bothered to make. Instead, I adjusted my grip on the flag and said, "Not today, Farzana." She smiled like I had confirmed I was weak. That evening, back home, the house felt too large. Hamza's reading glasses were beside his leather armchair. His half-finished crossword sat on the kitchen table next to a cold cup of tea I couldn't bring myself to pour out. At 7:15, my attorney Salman Qureshi came by with a leather folder and a worried look. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Ayesha," he said, "Farzana has contacted Succession Council." I let out one dry laugh. "Of course she has." Salman opened the folder. "You have every right to fight this. The house, Malik Precision, the estate accounts. None of this is simple, but you're not powerless." I looked at Hamza's chair. Then I said the words that made Salman blink twice. "Let her have it." Salman didn't say another word for several seconds. He stared across my kitchen table, waiting for me to explain. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. "Asha, grief makes people do strange things. If you need more time, we can wait before making any decisions. I've made one. You want to surrender everything?" I didn't say surrender. His eyebrows lifted. "Then what are you saying?" I looked toward the sitting room where Hamza's favorite leather armchair faced the television. The local television news channel was on mute, flashing stories neither of us cared about anymore. "I'm saying I don't want to fight like Farzana wants me to." Salman closed the folder. "I've handled inheritance and succession cases for 24 years, he said. "I've never seen someone this calm after losing both a husband and facing an inheritance dispute. I don't feel calm." That was the truth. The moment he left, I stood in Hamza's closet with one of his old army jackets pressed against my face and cried until my knees hurt from kneeling on the hardwood floor. There wasn't anything strategic about those tears. I missed my husband. The following Sunday, I attended the neighborhood mosque in Rawalpindi by myself for the first time in over 2 decades. Normally, Hamza would have insisted we arrive 15 minutes before the prayer. "Arriving late shows disrespect," he'd always say while reaching for his old pickup keys. That morning, I parked alone. People meant well. That didn't make it easier. Mrs. Naqvi embraced me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I remember you in every dua," she whispered. "Thank you." Then came the whispers. I heard Farzana hired a lawyer. "Is it true she's taking the company? Are you letting her have the house?" Small-town gossip spread fast, even across the sprawling Twin Cities. I smiled and kept walking. After the dua, Hamza's oldest army friend caught up with me in the parking lot. Brigadier Tariq Mahmoud had served with him for 18 years. He was 6'3", built like an old oak tree, and wore his dark green veteran's cap everywhere. He crossed his arms. "Ayesha." "Tariq, You going to tell me what's going on? I wish I knew. He looked straight into my eyes. Hamza would have fought. I smiled a no. Tariq frowned. He would have prepared. Tariq stood there, then he nodded once. I suppose you're right. Meanwhile, Farzana wasted no time. 3 days later, she invited half the Harper family to lunch at the well-known restaurant overlooking Rawal Lake. By dinner, everyone had heard her version of the story. Ayesha knows she can't win. She's doing the decent thing. My son built that business with the honor of our family name. It belongs with his family. After 21 years of marriage, I no longer count it as family. Even cousins I hadn't seen in years felt qualified to discuss my future. One afternoon, my neighbor Nadia carried over a dish of warm kheer. She placed it on my counter. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, she said, but are you okay? I laughed. No. She squeezed my hand. I didn't think so. For a while, we stood in the kitchen without talking. Sometimes silence is kinder than advice. A week later, Salman called. The first succession conference is next Tuesday. I'll be there. Ayesha, yes. If you're planning to let Farzana take everything, I need to know before we walk into that courtroom. I glanced toward Hamza's workshop behind the house. The lights were off. His old toolbox sat where he'd left it. I haven't changed my mind. Salman Sahil. I hope your husband left you something more than courage. After I hung up, I whispered to the empty kitchen. So do I. The truth was I wasn't as certain as everyone believed. Every night I lay awake wondering whether I was honoring Hamza's memory or making the biggest mistake of my life. By the time October arrived, people had stopped asking whether I planned to fight Farzana. They decided I wasn't. In Rawalpindi, word traveled quickly. By the time I walked into the giant grocery store or picked up my prescription at the neighborhood pharmacy, someone would tilt their head and give me that same sympathetic smile. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine. You've been through enough. I thanked them every time. None of them knew the whole story. Neither did I. One Monday morning, Salman drove me to Malik Precision Engineering in Islamabad. Hamza had asked me to stay involved after he retired from the army, handling payroll, pensions, and employee benefits, while he focused on running the shop. The company wasn't glamorous. We didn't build missiles or tanks. We repaired precision hydraulic systems used by rescue services, Rescue 1,122 teams, power and water authorities, and a handful of long-term government and defense contractors. Hamza often said there was more honor in fixing equipment that saved lives than making headlines. As soon as we stepped inside, the familiar smell of machine oil and fresh tea wrapped around me. Nothing had changed. Rashid, the production manager, hurried over. Mrs. Harper. You can call me Ayesha. He smiled weakly. We've all been wondering, is it true? I knew what he meant. Farzana says she's taking over. Several employees stopped pretending to work. Everyone was listening. I took a slow breath. The succession case is ongoing. Rashid hesitated. Are our jobs safe? That question hit me harder than anything Farzana had said. These weren't employees. Many had been with Hamza for 20 years or more. Some were retired servicemen. Others were sons and daughters of men who'd worked here before them. Their mortgages, retirement plans, and children's college tuition depended on this place. I don't know yet, I admitted. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only honest one. Later that afternoon, Rashid walked me through the machine shop. He stopped beside an old CNC milling machine. You remember when Colonel Harper bought this? I smiled. He drove to Lahore himself to inspect it. Rashid laughed. He spent 6 hours arguing over $15,000. Hamza loved negotiating. He wasn't cheap. Rashid grinned. He refused to waste money. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. A real laugh. It surprised both of us. When I returned home, I found Farzana's SUV parked across the street. She wasn't alone. A real estate agent stood beside her, pointing toward my house. They were measuring something. My driveway, the front porch, the flower beds Hamza had planted after retiring. I pulled into the garage without saying a word. A few minutes later, my neighbor Nadia knocked. You saw them. I did. Nadia rolled her eyes. She was telling the realtor she'd probably remodel the kitchen before Eid. I couldn't help smiling. She planned this fast. Nadia looked confused. You don't seem angry. Oh, I'm angry. So, why aren't you stopping her? I looked through the kitchen window toward Hamza's workshop, because that's what everyone expected me to do. Instead, every evening after dinner, I unlocked the workshop and sat at his old wooden workbench. Not to cry, not anymore. I started organizing. Military journals, maintenance logs, business binders, tax folders, old legal envelopes. Hamza labeled everything. Army habit. One binder held service records. Another contained supplier contracts dating back almost 15 years. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I wanted to understand the life we'd built together. Some nights I stayed out there until midnight. The radio played old ghazals while I sorted papers one folder at a time. A few times I found handwritten notes Hamza had tucked inside. Most were reminders. Call Rashid, renew insurance, order bearings, pieces of an ordinary life. Then one Thursday evening, something slipped from an old green binder onto the floor. It wasn't a bill, it wasn't a contract. It was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Hamza's unmistakable handwriting. I stared at it for a long time. My hand didn't feel steady anymore. I wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. I didn't open the envelope that night. I slid it back into the binder, closed the cover, and carried everything into the house. Some things deserve a clear mind. At my age, I'd learned that bad decisions often came from opening important things after midnight. The next morning, I made tea in Hamza's favorite navy blue mug. Even though he wasn't there to drink from it, the habit was comforting in a quiet sort of way. Outside, the mulberry tree in our front garden had begun dropping golden leaves across the driveway. Hamza used to complain about sweeping them. Then he'd spend the entire afternoon doing it anyway. I smiled at the memory. Moments like that caught me off guard. A few days later, Nadia knocked on my front door before breakfast. "You need to come outside." Her voice sounded halfway between annoyed and amused. I stepped onto the porch. Across the street, Farzana stood with two contractors. One held a clipboard. The other was taking measurements with a laser tape. They weren't looking at her own property. They were looking at mine. More specifically, my backyard. I walked across the lawn. "Morning, Farzana." She barely looked at me. "Oh, Ayesha." One contractor smiled. "Ma'am?" Farzana pointed toward Hamza's kitchen garden. "I'll probably remove all of this." I looked at the tomatoes that were almost finished for the season. Hamza had built those brick-edged beds by hand during his first summer after retirement. "They're difficult to maintain," Farzana continued. "I prefer open landscaping." I nodded. "I'm sure you do." She seemed disappointed that I hadn't argued. By Friday afternoon, another rumor had spread through the neighborhood. Farzana had ordered new living room furniture. Nadia called me. "You'll never believe this." "I probably will." "She's telling everyone she's moving in before Eid." I stirred a pot of homemade chicken yakni while holding the phone against my shoulder. "That's ambitious." "Ayesha." "What? Why are you so calm?" I looked out the kitchen window. "I'm not calm. You sound calm." I've stopped wasting energy trying to control what other people say. Nadia was quiet for a moment. "I wish I could do that." "So do I." Saturday brought another surprise. 3 of Malik Precision's longtime employees showed up at my door carrying donuts from a bakery in Sadar. Rashid came with them. "So," he said awkwardly, "we're checking on you." I laughed. "With cream rolls?" "Best medicine we could think of." We sat around my kitchen table for an hour. Nobody mentioned probate at first. Instead, we talked about cricket, rising prices, aching knees, and the new tea machine someone had bought for the shop. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Rashid cleared his throat. "Farzana visited the factory yesterday." I looked up. "What happened?" She introduced herself as the future owner. I felt my stomach tighten. Then, she asked for a list of employees over 60. The room became quiet. One of the machinists, Khalid, folded his hands. She said younger workers are cheaper. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Rashid looked at me. "Colonel Harper would have never treated people like that." "No," I said he wouldn't. Khalid reached across the table and patted my hand. "We don't care who owns the company." He paused. "We care who leads it." After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen thinking about those words. Leadership. Hamza used that word constantly. Not authority, not power, leadership. That evening, I carried the green binder back to the dining room table. The sealed envelope was inside. I traced my fingers over Hamza's handwriting. Ayesha, open this when the time feels right. I took a deep breath, then I broke the seal. Inside the envelope was a single handwritten letter. Hamza had never been one for long speeches. Even after 21 years of marriage, he'd rather fix a broken fence than sit down and talk about his feelings. So seeing 3 full pages in his handwriting made my chest tighten. The first line made me stop breathing for a second. My darling Ayesha, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and knowing my mother, she's probably making your life harder than it needs to be. Despite everything, I laughed. It sounded strange in an empty house. Making jokes, I whispered. I kept reading. Hamza wrote about ordinary things first. He reminded me to keep changing the furnace filter every fall because I'd always forget. He told me not to let anyone talk me into replacing his old pickup because it had another 100,000 miles left. Then his handwriting became more serious. You know me well enough to understand that I never walked into an operation without preparing an exit plan. Business isn't much different. I sat back in my chair. Operation. Even after 12 years of retirement, he thought like an army officer. The next paragraph caught my attention. Salman knows where the important papers are. If something ever feels wrong, ask him to check the blue estate binder, not the green one. I frowned. Blue binder. I'd spent 2 weeks organizing Hamza's office. I remembered a blue 3-ring binder sitting on the bottom shelf beneath several tax boxes. I walked back into the workshop. There it was, covered in a thin layer of dust. I carried it to the workbench and opened it. Inside were copies of registered trust documents, SECP filings and corporate records, and legal correspondence dating back almost 8 years. Most of it meant to me. One page, however, had a yellow sticky note attached. Salman. Review every 5 years. I stared at it. Why hadn't he ever mentioned this? Without waiting another minute, I called him. He answered on the second ring. Ayesha, I found something. 20 minutes later, Salman was sitting in my dining room with the blue binder spread across the table. He adjusted his reading glasses and began turning pages. The room was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. 5 minutes passed, then 10. His expression changed. Confusion, curiosity, disbelief. He stopped reading. He looked at one document, then another. He went back to the first one. No. He whispered it more to himself than to me. What is it? I asked. Instead of answering, he kept reading. His fingers trembled. When he reached the final page, he removed his glasses and looked at me. Ayesha. His voice was different now, much quieter. Hamza didn't hide anything. I don't understand. He documented everything the way he was supposed to. So, what does that mean? Salman tapped the binder. It means Malik Precision may not belong to Hamza's deceased's distributable estate. I blinked. What? And if I'm reading this correctly, he paused, neither does your house. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Outside, a school van rolled past the front of the house. Somewhere down the street, a water pump started. Life went on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. I found my voice. So, Farzana may have spent the last month fighting over property that isn't even part of the estate. Salman gave a slow nod. I need to verify every document before I say anything else. He closed the binder with unusual care. If these records are valid, and they certainly appear to be, the final succession hearing is going to unfold differently than anyone expects. For the first time since Hamza's funeral, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about the quiet smile he'd worn every time someone underestimated him. The final succession hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. on a chilly Tuesday morning at the Rawalpindi District Courts. I barely slept the night before. Not because I was afraid of Farzana. I was afraid of hope. After weeks of believing everything was slipping away, I had a reason to think Hamza had protected us all along. That kind of hope can be dangerous. If it turns out to be wrong, the fall hurts twice as much. At 6:30 that morning, I made paratha and scrambled eggs I couldn't eat. The tea grew cold beside my plate. Salman had called late the previous evening. I verified every document, and they're legitimate. I waited. But we have to let the process unfold. You're being awfully mysterious. He chuckled. I learned from your husband. That made me smile. By the time I reached the courthouse, the hallway outside Succession Courtroom, 3 was crowded. I recognized neighbors from Rawalpindi. Several retired servicemen from Hamza's Pakistan Ex-Servicemen Society chapter stood near the entrance. Rashid and half a dozen employees from Malik Precision had taken the morning off to attend. Even Nadia was there, carrying a steel travel cup that read "World's Most Tolerable Neighbor." She hugged me. "You look calm. I've had practice." She smiled. "I've also known you long enough to know that look." "What look?" "The one you get when you've made peace with whatever happens." I wish she were right. Inside, Farzana looked as though she were attending an awards banquet rather than a succession hearing. She wore a cream-colored designer suit, a pearl necklace, and a smile that had grown wider every week since Hamza's funeral. Her attorney, Barrister Cameron Shaw, arranged stacks of neatly labeled folders across the counsel table. When Farzana saw me, she walked over. "I hope there are no hard feelings, Ayesha." I looked at her for a moment. There should have been fewer hard words. She gave a small laugh. "This is business." "No?" I shook my head. "It stopped being business the day we buried your son." For the first time, her smile faded, only for a second. District Judge Nadia Rahman entered at 9:00. Everyone stood. After the usual formalities, Barrister Kamran Shah presented Farzana's claims with polished confidence. He spoke about family legacy, family lineage, generational ownership, responsibility. It was an impressive presentation. Then Salman stood. His entire opening statement lasted less than 2 minutes. "We have no objection to the petition as it relates to assets legally belonging to the deceased distributable estate." Several people exchanged confused looks. Even Judge Rahman glanced up from her notes. Kamran smiled. He thought we'd surrendered. The hearing continued. One document after another was placed before me. Salman slid each page across the table. "You understand what you're signing?" "I do." "I signature." Another. The scratching of my pen echoed through the silent courtroom. From the corner of my eye, I saw Farzana lean back. She folded her hands. She wasn't nervous anymore. She believed she'd won. When the last document reached me, Salman looked into my eyes. "You don't have any questions?" "I trust my husband." Then I signed the final page. A murmur spread through the gallery. Someone whispered. "She gave up." Another voice answered. "I can't believe it." Kamran closed his briefcase with obvious satisfaction. Farzana smiled at me, not kindly, triumphantly. Judge Rahman gathered the signed documents into a single file. She read for a minute. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then, instead of announcing the ruling, she closed the file. She removed her glasses, looked at Barrister Kamran Shah, and said, "Counsel, before I rule, I have one question." The room became so quiet I could hear the courthouse clock striking 10. Nobody spoke. Judge Nadia Rahman rested both hands on the closed file and looked at Barrister Cameron Shaw. "Counsel," she said evenly, "before this court enters a final order, I need clarification." Kamran stood. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge tilted her head. "Did you verify whether every asset listed in your petition is part of Colonel Harper's deceased's distributable estate?" The question seemed simple, almost routine. Kamran answered without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Rahman didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened a smaller folder that had been sitting beneath the court file. She studied one page, then another. She looked back at him. "Are you certain?" For the first time all morning, Cameron looked uncertain. He glanced toward Farzana. She gave him a confident nod. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge removed her reading glasses. Interesting. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear someone shifting in the back row. Salman didn't move. He folded his hands on the table. Judge Rahman turned another page. "Mr. Shah." "Yes, Your Honor." "Were you aware that Malik Precision Engineering was transferred into the Malik Family Legacy Trust over 7 years ago?" Kamran blinked. "I'm sorry." The judge repeated herself. "The Malik Family Legacy Trust." Silence. Kamran quickly opened one of his binders. He flipped through section after section. Nothing. He reached for another binder. His movements became faster, less controlled. Across the aisle, Farzana leaned toward him. "What is she talking about?" He didn't answer. Judge Rahman continued. "And were you also aware that the residence on Tulip Avenue, Baria Town, was conveyed into the same trust during that transaction?" My heart was pounding so loudly I wondered whether the people beside me could hear it. Kamran looked confused. Your Honor, those documents were never presented during discovery. Salman stood. They were registered with the sub-registrar in Rawalpindi and reflected in the company records in 2018. He handed a certified copy to the court clerk. The recording information is attached to the final page. The clerk walked it to the bench. Judge Rahman compared it with the papers in front of her. She nodded once. They match. A quiet murmur rolled through the courtroom. Rashid turned halfway in his seat and looked at me with wide eyes. Nadia covered her mouth. Even Brigadier Tariq Mahmoud looked surprised. Farzana grabbed Kamran's arm. What is this? He swallowed. I don't know. No? Her voice became sharper. You said everything was part of the estate. Kamran lowered his voice. That's what the petition indicated. Salman remained calm. The petition relied on outdated ownership records. Judge Rahman looked back toward Kamran. Counsel, did you independently verify ownership records before asking this court to distribute these assets? Kamran didn't answer. I relied on the information provided by my client. The judge nodded. I see. She made one brief note in the margin of the file. Then she looked toward Farzana. Mrs. Harper, this court cannot distribute property that is not legally owned by the estate. Farzana's confident smile disappeared. She looked from the judge to Kamran, then toward me. For the first time since Hamza's funeral, she looked frightened. I wish I could say I enjoyed it. The truth is I felt tired. Weeks of gossip, sleepless nights, watching strangers speculate about my marriage, watching loyal employees fear for their jobs. None of that could be erased by one moment in court. But Hamza had once told me something while we were repainting our porch. Truth doesn't always arrive first, he'd said. Sometimes it takes the long road. As I sat there listening to the silence inside that courtroom, I realized the truth had caught up. Nobody left the courtroom. Not the employees, not the neighbors, not even the reporters who had wandered in after hearing there was a dispute involving a well-known local business. Everyone seemed to realize they were watching something unexpected unfold. Judge Rahman turned another page in the registered trust documents before looking back at Salman. Mr. Qureshi, please explain the Malik family legacy trust for the record. Salman stood. Yes, Your Honor. He walked to the evidence table and picked up the blue binder Hamza had prepared years ago. Colonel Hamza Malik established the Malik Family Legacy Trust in June of 2018. It was reviewed, amended when necessary, and properly registered with the sub-registrar in Rawalpindi and reflected in the company records. He paused long enough for everyone to absorb that. The trust became the legal owner of Malik Precision Engineering. Barrister Kamran Shah found his voice. Your Honor, ownership may have transferred, but Mrs. Harper should control the trust. Salman calmly shook his head. No. He handed another document to the clerk. The trust has 3 co-trustees. Judge Rahman read their names aloud. Ayesha Malik. She looked up at me. Rashid Ahmed. Rashid fell out of his chair. And Pakistan Ex-Servicemen Welfare Foundation. The room filled with quiet murmurs. Rashid whispered, Me? I nodded. I didn't know either. Hamza had never mentioned it. Salman continued. The trust requires unanimous approval from all 3 trustees before the business can be sold, dissolved, or relocated. Kamran frowned. So, Mrs. Harper can't sell the company? No one can, Salman answered. Not without meeting the conditions Colonel Harper established. Judge Rahman looked impressed. What conditions? Salman smiled for the first time that morning. The company must continue operating in the Islamabad-Rawalpindi region. Several employees exchanged relieved glances. It must maintain ex-servicemen hiring program, Tariq whispered. That's Hamza. And no fewer than 80% of its full-time employees must be retained during any ownership transition. Khalid let out a breath so loudly that several people laughed. Even the judge smiled. So, she said, Colonel Harper intended to protect both the business and the people working there. Your Honor. Farzana was no longer sitting. She leaned toward Kamran. There has to be something. He didn't answer. She grabbed his sleeve. There has to be, Kamran spoke. The trust appears valid. Appears? I need to review it further. Judge Rahman looked at Farzana. Mrs. Harper, regardless of how you feel about these arrangements, this court cannot disregard legally executed registered trust documents. Farzana shook her head. My son would never cut me out. Salman's voice remained respectful. He didn't. Everyone looked toward him. The trust provides Mrs. Farzana Malik with a one-time distribution of $50,000. Farzana blinked. $50,000? Salman nodded. Colonel Harper also wrote a personal letter explaining why. Judge Rahman looked surprised. A letter? Salman handed it to the clerk. It was attached to the trust. The judge read silently for a minute. When she finished, her expression softened. I'm not going to read this aloud, she said. It was clearly intended as a private message. She folded the letter. But I will say this. She looked around the courtroom. Colonel Harper devoted considerable thought to ensuring his family, his employees, and his community were all cared for after his death. No one spoke. The silence felt different now, peaceful, purposeful. The judge signed several orders before closing the file one final time. The claims seeking ownership of Malik Precision Engineering and the residence on Tulip Avenue, Baria Town, are denied. Her gavel spick up once. Those assets are not part of the deceased's distributable estate. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. When the hearing ended, nobody rushed for the exit. People stayed where they were almost as if they needed a minute to process what had happened. Farzana remained seated. She wasn't crying. She simply stared at the table in front of her. Barrister Kamran Shah quietly packed his files without saying a word. Salman gathered our documents and looked over at me. You all right? I nodded. I think so. You don't sound convinced. I smiled. I've been carrying this weight for weeks. It feels strange not to have it anymore. He understood. Some victories don't make you want to celebrate. They just let you breathe again. Outside the Rawalpindi district courts, the autumn air felt cooler than it had that morning. A group of local reporters had already gathered near the courthouse steps. One recognized Farzana immediately. Mrs. Harper, she stopped walking. Do you have a comment on today's ruling? She glanced toward Cameron. He quietly shook his head. Another reporter stepped forward. Did you know the company wasn't part of the estate? No answer. A third asked, what happens now with Malik Precision? Farzana opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, she didn't seem to have anything to say. The reporters soon turned toward me. A young woman holding a microphone smiled politely. Mrs. Harper, many people expected a long legal battle. Instead, today's hearing ended very differently. How do you feel? I thought about the question. Then I answered honestly, relieved. Do you consider today's outcome a victory? I looked across the parking lot where several Malik Precision employees were waiting. Rashid, Khalid, Maywish from accounting, Talha from shipping. People Hamza had trusted for years. I think my husband would be happy, the reporter nodded. And your mother-in-law? I truly hope she finds peace. Salman glanced at me with a small smile. That wasn't the answer anyone expected. As we walked toward the parking garage, Rashid caught up with us. He looked like a man who had just escaped a tornado. I still can't believe Colonel Harper made me a trustee. Neither can I. He laughed. You know what the first thing everyone asked me was? What? Are we all keeping our jobs? And Rashid grinned. I told them yes. He paused. Ayesha, thank you. I frowned. For what? For never treating us like we were just employees. I felt my throat tighten. Hamza taught me that. No. Rashid shook his head. He showed you. You chose to live it. The following Monday, I visited Malik Precision for the first time since the hearing. The mood inside the shop had completely changed. Machines hummed. Forklifts moved across the warehouse. Someone had brought in donuts. Someone else had started a fresh pot of tea. It felt alive again. Khalid walked over carrying a cardboard box. We found something in Colonel Harper's office. Inside were dozens of handwritten thank you notes Hamza had written over the years. Birthday cards, retirement congratulations, notes thanking employees for staying late during winter power cuts and heavy rain. One envelope had never been mailed. It was addressed simply, to whoever leads this company after me. Rashid looked at me. You should read it. I carefully unfolded the letter. It wasn't about profits. It wasn't about contracts. Hamza had written only one sentence. Take care of the people and the business will take care of itself. I smiled. That sounds exactly like him, Rashid laughed. That's because nobody ever won an argument with the colonel. We both laughed for the first time since his funeral. The laughter didn't hurt. It felt like he was still leading us, just in a different way. Winter arrived quietly that year. By December, the mulberry tree in the front garden had dropped its last leaf, and the mornings in Rawalpindi carried that familiar bite of cold that makes you pull your coat a little tighter. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after the court hearing. Real life never works that way. There were insurance forms to finish, accountants to meet with, and more trust paperwork than I ever imagined possible. Every Tuesday afternoon, Rashid and I met in Hamza's old office to review company reports. At first, I felt out of place sitting behind his desk. Eventually, I realized I wasn't replacing him. I was protecting what he had built. The employees noticed the difference. Nobody worried about losing their job anymore. Instead, they started bringing ideas. One suggested updating the break room. Another wanted to expand the apprenticeship program for retired servicemen returning to civilian life. By the following spring, we welcomed our first 3 apprentices. One had served in the tribal districts. Another had spent 20 years in the Pakistan Navy. The youngest had recently left the Army after 8 years as an Army mechanic. Watching them walk through the shop reminded me of Hamza. He always believed experience should be passed on, not locked away. A few weeks before Defense Day, I received an unexpected letter. The return address belonged to Farzana. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No lawyer, no demands, no accusations, just a short note. Ayesha. I spent so much time trying to hold on to what Hamza owned that I forgot to appreciate who he was. I can't change what happened. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. There was no request for forgiveness, no excuse, only those few sentences. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same blue binder that had changed everything. Some apologies don't erase the past, but they can keep bitterness from following you into the future. On Defense Day morning, I drove to the Army graveyard in Rawalpindi, carrying fresh white jasmine and roses. The grounds were peaceful. Rows of marble headstones stretched farther than the eye could see. I found Hamza's grave without looking at the map. I always could. I knelt, brushed a few leaves away from the base of the stone, and placed the flowers beside it. For a while, I simply stood there. No speeches, no tears, just gratitude. I finally understand, I said quietly. You weren't protecting the money. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. You were protecting the people. That had always been Hamza's mission. The house was never just a house. The company was never just a business. They were places where lives had been built, friendships had grown, and families had found stability. His greatest legacy wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the people who were still standing because he had cared enough to plan ahead. As I walked back toward the parking lot, I realized something that surprised me. I no longer wanted revenge. Justice had already done its work. What remained was peace. And after everything that had happened, peace felt like the greatest inheritance of all. If this story reminded you that kindness, patience, and integrity can outlast greed, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope you'll join me again for another story. The end.